Well, thank you very much for joining us for today's press briefing on what the state is doing to slow the spread of coronavirus here in Nebraska, and also what we're doing to get us growing again. However, before we get into our program, I do want to talk about the weekend events. Over the last several days, we have seen a level of disruption and chaos in Omaha and Lincoln that we haven't seen in recent memory. What has started out as peaceful protests has been hijacked by people who want to cause harm in Lincoln and Omaha. Now, the protests are about the very real issues that face minority communities with regard to equal access to justice and how they're treated by law enforcement. And the case of George Floyd highlights this with what that former police officer did to him, how he killed him right there on the street. And justice must be served for George Floyd. And to the folks out there who are hurting, we hear you. We know we must continue to work to be able to provide that equal access to justice for our minority communities. However, what we saw this weekend with the violence, loss of life, and property destruction only takes away and detracts from the memory of George Floyd and the cause of trying to achieve that equal access. This weekend has been a terrible one here in Nebraska with the violence that we have seen. And I want everybody to know that my administration will continue to work with minority communities on how we can make progress toward a more equal and just society. I also know that as we speak, County Attorney for Douglas County, Don Klein, is talking about the charges with regard to the shooting that happened Saturday night. And that press conference is still going on right now. I know that Mr. Klein has made the decision that he is not going to press charges at this time against the shooter. And that's not going to make some people at least happy. I want to address this right up front as well. Don Klein is a well-respected prosecutor. He's respected in the law community in both Omaha and here in Lincoln. I've worked with Don for the last 5.5 years. And while this is certainly not my area of expertise, if Don Klein does not believe that he can bring charges at this time, I believe him. And what I'd ask is that everybody go watch the videos that are out there and keep an open mind when you're looking at this. We have to heal. We have to move on together. And while I know emotions will be high at this time, the only way we can do that is we have peace and calm. I want to thank the protesters this past weekend who remained peaceful, who did the right thing, who took a very important issue and treated it with the dignity it deserved by not creating violence or damaging property. And I want to thank all the people in Omaha and Lincoln who came out to help clean up after the weekend violence that we had, that helped sweep up glass. There were many people who just volunteered to come out. I want to thank those folks. I want to thank law enforcement who exercised patience and discipline in helping to keep people safe. I want to thank the mayors of Omaha and Lincoln for our work together. And I want to thank the members of the Nebraska State Patrol and the Nebraska National Guard for their work to be able to help keep people safe. Our State Patrol has continued to do a wonderful job, and we have once again called upon the members of our Nebraska National Guard to serve their community. Last year was the flooding. This year it's been with regard to pandemic. In times past, they've also gone on to help other people with regard to hurricanes and other natural disasters. And over the weekend, they assisted our law enforcement in keeping the peace in Omaha and Lincoln. I want to encourage everybody to, again, think about the events of this weekend and to stay peaceful. I understand that people are going to want to express their First Amendment rights. It's right that they do that. But please do it in a peaceful way. And we will have curfews in both Omaha and Lincoln. So please, folks, go home tonight. Protest peacefully and go home before the curfews. Now, moving on to our other information that we wanted to share with you today. With regard to hospital data, hospital system in Nebraska continues to be very stable, and we are at 45% of our hospital beds available, 49% of our ICU beds, and 77% of our ventilator beds. In fact, in Douglas County, I just looked for the data for yesterday, we're at 30% ICU beds, so showing a recovery there with regard to that. One of the other announcements I wanted to make with regard to hospital beds, in consultation with Dr. Antone and a number of the systems across the state and the hospital CMOs and so forth and our public health officials, we are going to be changing, effective today, June 1st, the 30%, 30%, 30% rule that we had in place for hospital beds, ICU beds, and ventilators, and changing that to a 15%, 15%, 15% rule for hospital beds, ICUs, beds, and ventilators. So reducing that requirement that hospitals have to keep from 30% down to 15%, we believe that is something that we can do that is manageable within the current system. And certainly, as we've seen for the last 2 weeks or so, 3 weeks, even with the increased cases, the hospital system has remained stable in Douglas County, where we've been keeping our eye on. Testing schedule for this week. We're going to be in Chadron, Alliance, Scottsbluff, Sidney, Broken Bow, Burwell, St. Paul, Valentine, O'Neill, Norfolk, Columbus, York, Lincoln, Fremont, Bellevue, and Omaha. Also, one of the things that we have talked about a lot with regard to this pandemic has been our child care facilities, our daycare centers, and so forth, and what we can do to help make sure that they can continue to serve people. Today, we've got Stephanie Beasley, who is the director for our Children and Family Services division at the Department of Health and Human Services, who is going to talk about a CARES Act grant of $20 million to the state of Nebraska to be able to help these facilities remain open or get open. And Stephanie, I'm going to ask you to come up and give us the details with regard to what the state is going to be doing to help these facilities. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Governor, for your continued leadership and support ensuring child care access throughout Nebraska. So I'm pleased to share the CARES Act recently provided Nebraska $20 million in child care and development block grant funds. These funds provide the department additional resources to respond to the effects COVID-19 has had on children, families, licensed child care centers, and licensed family home providers. Back in April, I reported about 16% of licensed child care programs had temporarily closed since the COVID-19 pandemic and emergency declaration. This has decreased only slightly, as the impact on child care providers has really been tremendous. In April, the governor announced an executive order allowing licensed child care subsidy providers the option to bill for absent days during the emergency declaration, and secondly, allowing families receiving child care subsidy the option of using licensed, exempt in-home child care if their center was closed. Children and Family Services is working to ensure child care is available to families during this pandemic to allow families to continue working for their employers. We are focusing the CARES Act funding to help child care, family home providers, and child care centers stay in business to continue to provide safe, high-quality child care to children. I'm happy to announce the department's plan to use the CARE Fund dollars. We feel the use of these dollars will support family child care providers, child care centers, and assist families in finding high-quality licensed child care. First, the department will fund the remaining applications to the Child Care Relief Fund. This was a relief fund made available to licensed child care centers in early April. This opportunity was led by the Nebraska Children and Families Foundation in partnership with the department and other private entities. It became evident that this early opportunity, more funding was needed than the original grant funds provided. Providers would greatly benefit from additional grants. And this leads us to our next two grant opportunities I'd like to share. The first is the Childcare Provider Stabilization Grant Fund. We know that many childcare centers remain open to serve families, but due to directed health measures or parents keeping their children home, the number of children they care for has been reduced. This grant opportunity will help licensed childcare providers fill that gap. This grant offers a one-time payment of $3,500 to family childcare homes and $5,500 to childcare centers. Providers must be open and operating for at least 30 days prior to submitting their application. The second grant opportunity will be an incentive to reopen childcare centers and childcare homes. To better serve childcare providers who have discontinued operations temporarily during the COVID-19 pandemic, grants will be provided to providers who currently have closed but are committed to reopening within 30 days. The department is collaborating with the Nebraska Children and Families Foundation on the administration of these grant opportunities, and more information will be released soon. The department also plans to invest CARES Act dollar into the newly created Child Care Referral Network website. This website was created to help families find safe, high-quality child care. A public-private collaboration of agencies and organizations rapidly developed an online searchable database that connected working parents to child care providers that have open care spots in their center or in their home. Funds will help provide the data collection process with technology platform to sustain the network. Lastly, the department is investing in initiatives that will support after-school programs, summer programs, and school-age specific child care. We know that normal, planned summer care programs may not be taking place, and we are working with a task force to address this issue and ensure care is available for those who need it. These supports will help families access high-quality child care across Nebraska and will help us support child care providers to remain in business to continue to provide high-quality care for children. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. The schedule for this week, again, a reminder, we're changing up the schedule, so we will be doing our next briefing at 2 o'clock Central Time on Thursday in English, and then we'll be doing our Spanish language briefing at 3 p.m. on Thursday. And just a reminder, last week was my last town hall on NET, so I will not be on NET this week. So again, just Thursday at 2 p.m. Central in English and 3 p.m. in Spanish. So we'll get into some questions here then. Christian Wagner, NTV, what can Governor Ricketts tell us about the conference call between the governors and President Trump? Some reports have the president agitated and calling the governors to dominate when it comes to protests. You know, those calls are set up so that the president can have candid conversations with the governors. The press is not allowed on the phone calls, so I'm not going to comment on what goes on in those phone calls to really respect the candid nature of those conversations so we can keep them candid and continue to have that great dialogue. Grant Schulte, Associated Press, given the weekend's protests, are you expecting a flare-up of more coronavirus cases within the next weeks or so? Some law enforcement officers and protesters were not masked. Yeah, that is certainly something that we are concerned about because, again, how does the coronavirus spread? Well, it spreads when you've got large groups of people that are clustering together within 6 feet of each other without using masks. So we're certainly concerned about that potential for additional spread of the coronavirus. And if you're out there protesting, it would be a good idea to wear a mask. How much overtime has the State Patrol accumulated so far from the protests? Given the impact the pandemic has had on state revenues, how much concern is there for the state budget? We have not been keeping track. I mean, we're keeping track of the State Patrol's overtime, but we have not compiled that data for just this series of events over the weekend. So we can certainly get that data for you later, but right now that has not been our focus to look at that. And with regard to the budget, we're going to continue to monitor the budget. We're going to continue to monitor our revenues. We will manage it just like every Nebraska family has to manage it. If we have to tighten our belt, we'll tighten our belt to be able to get through this. Back in 2018, you supported a bill, LB 791, that was designed to increase accountability within law enforcement. Given the civil unrest in Nebraska and nationally, do you believe more legislative action is needed? With regard to that bill, yeah, that was about creating more accountability for law enforcement here in the state. I think that we took a lead role in being able to get that done in 2018 here in Nebraska. The bill ended up getting changed so that it only applied to the Nebraska State Patrol, and we're certainly happy to go into more detail with regard to that bill at a later date with regard to why that happened. But again, the bill that we worked together with Senator Albright to introduce was a much stronger bill than the bill that ended up getting through the legislature. And we can talk about, again, who were the people that weakened that bill later, because it was some of the folks on the other side of the aisle. Andrew Rozaki, KETV. A viewer with disability wants to know why nothing has been done to make Test Nebraska accessible to Nebraskans who are blind, deaf, or other disabilities. Why should they have to get tests through private insurance when anyone else can get free tests? If you disability test, you have to, just the kind of the challenges in scheduling a van and so forth, and then also, are you violating federal law? Test Nebraska is one way that we have to be able to get tested here in Nebraska. We wanted to make sure we got that in as quickly as possible. So again, as we've talked about in the past, we wanted to make sure we had a solution that was going to work to increase testing. It has helped us increase testing here in Nebraska significantly. I think if you look at where we are today, we've tested over 100,000 people, or we've done over 100,000 tests here in the state of Nebraska. And going back to the middle part of April, when I think we started talking about this program, we were not nearly at that many. In fact, we did over twice as many tests in May than we did in March and April combined. So the point of Test Nebraska was to ramp up that testing in what we knew wasn't going to be a solution that worked for everybody, but that would work to be able to get more testing done broadly based. If you're a person with disability, again, you've got other options out there. You can go to, for example, one of your health clinics. And for example, Charles Drew, One World, Blue Stem here in town, and nobody's charging for any of these tests. Private insurance isn't charging for any of these tests. In fact, that was one of the first things that we announced, is that all the insurance companies had agreed that they were not going to charge for this test, and nor is the care that's associated with having coronavirus going to be charged either. Again, no one has to worry about receiving care because of an inability to pay. So there are other alternatives with regard to how folks can get that testing, and certainly we'll work with folks to be able to do that. We are doing that here for our state facilities and so forth, so we're certainly willing to continue to work to make sure everybody has that access. And Taylor, did you have any other questions that were texted in?
Yeah, just a couple. There's Valerie Morez from TV Sisters of Viral social media post asking folks to help donate money to help with reconstruction in Lincoln, Omaha. Do we know anything about that?
So, sorry, who was asking that question?
Valerie from NTV.
Valerie from NTV was asking about a viral post, people raising money to be able to help do repair in Omaha and Lincoln. I do not know anything about that, and while that one may be completely legitimate, I do want to caution folks that you do have to be careful during these times with the online fundraising to make sure that whichever nonprofit you're giving to is a legitimate nonprofit that's going to be using your dollars for the mission that they tell you they're going to use it for.
Sarah Kirkley wants to know if the pandemic's crowd size limitations apply to protests.
So Sarah Kirkley, NTV, wants to know that whether or not the pandemic crowd size applies to pandemic. We made the decision over the weekend that, given the nature of the protests and the importance of the issue with regard to justice for George Floyd, that we had to strike that balance. And it's one of the things we've talked about a lot, is about trying to find that balance, striking that balance. And we felt in this case that the balance weighed in favor of the First Amendment rights of the protesters to be able to have crowd sizes larger than what was allowed under the DHM because of the nature of the events and what was going on. So we made that decision proactively, that the First Amendment rights here outweighed the concerns with regard to the pandemic. All right, and so since Taylor has walked off, I presume that we are then done with questions that are being texted in. I'll remind folks, I do have to get on the road here to go to Omaha for another press briefing, so we're going to have to keep this one relatively short. And Joanne, since you're not here very often, I'm going to let you start.
Thank you. I have three, but I'll be really quick.
Okay, she's got three.
We have a person that asked us to ask you, because of the international travel and the quarantine that has been imposed with the DHM. They're saying that the United States has higher cases than a lot of these foreign countries. There are a lot of people who want to go, like honeymooners who want to go to the Caribbean. They're being told by their workplace that if they won't get paid for having to quarantine for 2 weeks for going there. Just wondering if there are exceptions you can make because of these things.
So the question was, with regard to the quarantine, with regard to international travel, there's people, say, for example, that want to go on trips overseas and then come back. They're being told that if they come back and have to quarantine, that they're not going to get paid for that time off. And I guess my response would be, there's not going to be any exceptions for international travel. That, look, it's an emergency. It's a pandemic emergency. And I know this has been inconvenient for a lot of people. But we have to make sure that we're protecting, the public here in reducing the spread of the virus. So again, if you do make that decision to travel internationally, when you come back, you will have to quarantine for 2 weeks.
Can I slip in another?
Go ahead. Since you're not here very often, we'll let you do the other two.
When you say you're going to continue to work with communities of color, can you be a little more specific in how you're working?
Sure. So the question was, when I say I continue to work with communities of color, can I say specifically what I'm talking about? So for example, I'll take the most recent example is this pandemic. We've had calls with leaders in both North and South Omaha with regard to what the state is doing to help respond to that pandemic. I would say it was about, was it a week ago last Friday that we put out a press release, a 10-point plan that we worked on with some folks from North and South Omaha with regard to how we were going to respond and include, for example, getting more testing to Charles Drew and to One World, which I think if you talk to Kenny McMorris there, he'll tell you that he's got capacity to do more tests. He's got more tests than he's currently doing with regard to testing. So that's an example of how we would making sure that he's got the resources he needs to be able to test in his community. It also talks about the economic, I think point number 10 on that one is specifically talking about the economic development plans, working together with Tony Goins, who's going to lead that, to be able to do that. So that's kind of the most recent example we've been talking about, but One World's in that same category, making sure that, we have phone calls with, Andrea Skolkin about the testing she's got, providing her the National Guard to be able to do more testing at One World and giving her staff a break. So that's just kind of the most recent example through this pandemic and how we've been working with communities in North and South Omaha to be able to, provide for the things that they're looking to have done as far as services and also building trust and relationships. Okay, you have one more?
One more. It's been reported that the president says that the governors need to get tougher on demonstrators. Do you feel that Lincoln and Omaha or the state needs to be tougher on them?
So the question was, the president has reportedly said that governors need to get tougher on demonstrators, and do we feel like we need to get tougher in Lincoln and Omaha? I think that, we're working with our local partners, the mayor of Omaha, the mayor of Lincoln, Chief Bleimeister, Chief Schmaderer, to be able to craft a plan to be able to allow people to express their First Amendment rights, but also do it in a safe way. And what you saw was that as we saw the escalating violence from a small group of the protesters, I believe it is just a small group of the protesters, I think the vast majority are trying to do it peacefully. We saw certainly in Omaha where protesters were trying to police themselves, tell people to stop breaking things, came out to help clean up afterwards, that sort of thing. I think the vast majority of protesters are trying to do the right thing, but there are that small number of people who really are not about the cause, they're about violence. And that's where we have to make sure that we're exercising the appropriate amount of force to be able to separate those people who are causing the violence and arrest them and take them into custody and charge them appropriately versus the vast majority of the protesters who are trying to express their First Amendment rights in a peaceful way. So I believe that the plans that the chiefs have put together with the support of the Nebraska State Patrol and the National Guard have been appropriate. Martha.
On the access for people with disabilities to Test Nebraska, the Test Nebraska has now been up and running for a while. Why can't you make some changes to make it more accessible for people with disabilities instead of just being locked into what was originally set up?
So Martha asked, gee, you've been running Test Nebraska now for several weeks. Why can't you make it more accessible for people with disabilities? And again, what we needed to do, Martha, is continue to work on getting the system down for the regular customers, so to speak. If you want to think about it, the drive-up customers that we had originally designed the system, or the system was originally designed to serve. And we will be flexible with regard to how we're serving other populations to be able to do that. So for example, when we're in different communities, we'll go to long-term care facilities and be able to do testing there. So I'm not saying that we won't do that. I'm just saying, start a business, we've been around for just a few weeks. You know, as you saw last week, we got the capacity to get up to over 3,000 tests per day, so we're reaching those milestones, and as we check off these milestones, we'll move on to the next ones to be able to do. So we're not saying no, but I'm just saying that we've been working on getting the system up and running, and we got to the 3,000 tests last week. We reached that milestone, and now we're working on other milestones to be able to expand the amount of people that we're testing through Test Nebraska. My point was, though, other folks have opportunities to get tested in different ways that are not going to be charged for, that are maybe more suitable to how they want to get served. So again, one of the things we've said all along is, for folks who don't want to be tested through Test Nebraska, we're offering other options.
Two last questions.
Yeah, Fred.
I wasn't here Friday. Did you reach 3,000 tests today?
So yeah, it was widely reported in the test. There was a story in the Lincoln Journal-Star, I believe, a test through the lab where they said they're able to, their capacity within the lab is 3,000 tests per day. So we haven't actually tested 3,000 people today. The capacity in the lab is 3,000, is over 3,000 tests per day. We still have to get to the point where we're swabbing that many. Yeah. So you didn't miss anything, Fred.
Last question.
Yeah. Lee?
The response this evening in Omaha, in wake of the non-prosecution on the part of the county attorney, what is your message to Omaha? You spoke a little bit at the beginning about do it peacefully and do it in a way that gets your message across, but people are outraged right now knowing that the life was taken without full clarity to the public. What is your message to those protesters in wake of what happened?
Sir, I can certainly imagine that there'll be some raw feelings with regard to the decision that the county attorney made. I would encourage people to go look at the video, first of all, and keep an open mind when they do. And then for the protesters, you know, the vast majority of protesters have been peaceful. Please protest in a safe way, in a peaceful way. Do not resort to violence. That only detracts from the goals that you're trying to accomplish. And it's not a way for us to have healing in the community to be able to allow us to move on and address the issues, the very legitimate issues that communities of color have with regard to equal access to the justice system. So my message would be protest peacefully, and when the curfew comes, please go home. Please go home and help make sure that we can have a peace and calm that allows us to move forward. Great. Well, again, folks, thank you very much. I appreciate it, and we'll be back here Thursday at 2 p.m.